LSD had arrived, and over the next 20 years, its remarkable conscious-altering properties would see it transformed from an experimental drug into the psychedelic component of a revolution. In the early 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency embarked on a Cold War mind control program codenamed MK-Ultra. The effects of LSD and other psychoactive compounds on the human brain were of great interest as possible espionage tools. By 1959, CIA scientists in San Francisco were offering $100 to individuals who would take the drugs and answer questions about their hallucinogenic experiences. The experiments were conducted at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital near Stanford University. A 26-year-old creative writing student named Ken Kesey was one of the test subjects. His experiences at the hospital provided raw material for his first published novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and set him on his own course of mind-expanding explorations with LSD.
When we were taken as part of the drug experiments that they gave to us there in Menlo Park, it seemed right. That here's America going forward in the way it's supposed to go forward. We're supposed to explore these new lands, and this is definitely a new damn land, and the doctors didn't have the balls to go in there and do it themselves, so they hired students to do it. The CIA brought LSD to the USA. It was the government. I mean, shit, the government's giving it as drugs. It's bound to be good stuff, and it was the best stuff of all.
The CIA had originally planned LSD to be used as a truth serum or a control device. They wanted to control the population, but instead, young people started to experiment with themselves. They would deprogram themselves from the mainstream culture, but then reprogram themselves with their own value system. And so the whole CIA scenario backfired.
LSD was not yet illegal in 1964, when Kesey shared it with friends at his La Honda, California retreat. He organized activities designed to enhance interpersonal communications, and his informal theatrical parties took on all the mixed media elements that came to represent psychedelic tripping. Kesey called them the Merry Pranksters, and in the summer of 1964, they boarded the Dayglow International Harvester bus for a cross-country trip that would go down in the annals of 60s counterculture history. Kesey's goal was to travel to New York for the publication of his second novel, but the excursion quickly became a mythological rebel quest in the bus named Further.
They did it with such a sense of humor that people couldn't figure out what's their angle. You know, what do they want to get out of this? Do they want money? Do they want to sell something? And, you know, they just wanted to spread joy and a sense of healthy rebellion against a constricting civilization.
It was a psychedelic search for it, a mind-bending version of Jack Kerouac's beat novel, On the Road, complete with the legendary Neil Cassidy behind the wheel, Kerouac's real-life Dean Moriarty.
All of us had read Kerouac. We were spawn of Kerouac. Neil Cassidy was a hero. This was the best gunfighters in the West, and they were kind of taking us on to show us, you know, how to do gun tricks. And it was an honor, tremendous honor, still is.
He was simply plugged into the cosmos. Cowboy Neil at the wheel of the bus to Never Ever Land. There was this incredibly complex phenomenon going on that mixed social bohemians and psychedelics on a level that's never happened, possibly in world history, before or since.
It was really wonderful to shotgun for him going down the road, because he'd be peeling an orange and rolling a joint and steering the bus and, you know, carrying on about 4 conversations. And somehow or other, I, you know, had to put in pertinent data about we're supposed to go left in a mile or something like this into this this stream of wonder.
We were having a good time. There's nothing more fun than riding this bus around and having people look up at you and smile. So the bus itself has its own power, its own magic.
By 1966, Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters were sharing the LSD experience with hundreds of young people in Southern California. The pranksters put on a series of psychedelic parties called acid tests. With music by the Grateful Dead and tubs filled with LSD-spiked electric Kool-Aid, it was Kesey's way of spreading the news. LSD was a revolutionary mind-freeing tool that he hoped would change the world.
It was on the eve of Lincoln's birthday. We had rented this huge warehouse in Watts. And I remember spending the first part of the evening on the microphone explaining to people that the Kool-Aid on the right is the electric Kool-Aid, and the Kool-Aid on the left is for kids. This was the eve that LSD became illegal, by the way. But people would finish dancing for 3 hours to the Grateful Dead, and anything wet was what they were swallowing and not heeding my advice at all. And something wet could be about, 100 mics a swallow. So at a certain point, everybody started to go into a meltdown kind of situation. And this one girl started freaking out, and she's going, "Who cares? Who cares?" So I set off in my quest for the Who Cares girl, and eventually found her in a little side room. And as I found her, there were also about 25 other people who had found her, and we made a circle around her, and we joined hands. The minute we joined hands, we turned into jewels and light. She turned into jewels and light, and I got it. That when you come to the very bottom of the human soul where the knit hits the grit and you're sinking, but if you reach out to help somebody who's sinking worse than you are, everybody's going to get high. And I don't even think you have to have acid around to do it.
It's difficult to explain because what we're talking about is psychedelics. And people have always known that you need that little madness, but it was a while before anybody found the right pill to give you that little madness that you can dip into and come back from.
Ken Kesey wasn't alone in his thinking about mind expansion in the 60s. There was also a research psychologist turned rebel guru whose name would become synonymous with the psychedelic revolution.
Have I answered the question, who am I? Mm-hmm. Well, I confront it all the time.
In the early 1960s, Timothy Leary pioneered new forms of psychotherapy at the Harvard Center for Personality Research. But a radical departure from conventional psychiatry came with his introduction to consciousness-altering drugs. He established the Psychedelic Drug Research Program and began case studies with an LSD-related substance known as psilocybin.
When I first met him, he talked about his first experience with the mushroom, the psilocybin mushroom, as the most important religious experience of his life.
I took Mexican mushrooms, the so-called magic mushrooms of Mexico, and I learned more about my brain and its possibilities, and I learned more about psychology in the 5 hours after taking these mushrooms than I had in the preceding 15 years of studying, doing research in psychology.
I respected Tim's research at Harvard. I read about it in the early 60s. Once I had tried LSD, about 1963 or 64, I was, like everybody else, utterly blown away by this level of consciousness that I didn't think existed. It changes you. It enlarges your perspective. And I was aware of Leary's research and how deep he went and the positive spin he put on consciousness change.
Well, he said very early on, question authority. And authority hates to be questioned. And he was a combative Irishman. He was had his wit and he had his intelligence, and he brought it to bear on the government and what they were doing to young people, what they were doing to him.
By 1963, Leary's research at Harvard was coming under fire from faculty colleagues, and he was relieved of his teaching duties. Determined to continue working on mind expansion, he moved to an old mansion in upstate New York called Millbrook. From 1963 until 1967, Millbrook served as Leary's communal psychedelic oasis. He led seminars to inform people about the best settings in which to experience LSD. His message was about transformative spiritual discovery, the ancient belief in mystical sacred vision.
Leary certainly believed that there were certain universal truths, and that psychotropics was perhaps a way for us to experience those, and that we were certainly not the first people in history who had experienced those things.
He wrote the American version of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He translated a psychedelic version of the Tao Te Ching, and brought those esoteric books into common use amongst people who were using LSD.
Millbrook was like a magnet. It drew people to it. And of course, as so many communities during that time, it was overwhelmed by people and their needs, and it didn't always attract the most competent or capable people. So the community waxed and waned and suffered and grew and was wonderful most of the time, horrible some of the other times, but always an incredible place to be.
We always have urged people, don't take LSD unless you're very well prepared, unless you're specifically prepared to go out of your mind. Don't take it unless you have someone that's very experienced with you to guide you through it. And don't take it unless you are ready to have your perspective on yourself and life dramatically change, because you're going to be a different person, and you should be ready.
It didn't happen for everybody. Reactions to LSD are as varied as the people who took it. But for some of us, it truly opened the doors of perception.
By turn on, we mean tune in, to get beyond your routine ways of thinking and acting and experiencing. And we often say that we're teaching people how to use their head. The point is that in order to use your head, you have to go out of your mind. You have to go out of all of the static, symbolic ways in which you think.
Turning on, obviously, was changing your consciousness and then tuning into the more eternal realities, going deeply inside. And then, of course, dropping out really meant, that was the most misunderstood part of it, it didn't mean, just quit and leave and live like a hermit. It just meant drop out of the social games that were destructive, that wasn't furthering, the majority of the people.
What Timothy meant was think for yourself. Don't accept something because an authority tells you to. Think for yourself, and you'll find out that a lot of those so-called authorities are bullshit.
In 1966, LSD became an illegal drug in the United States. Timothy Leary's research was outlawed. The CIA's mind control drug was now being used for consciousness expansion, and this was the last thing the government wanted for its citizens.
The important thing about Leary is the research that he did has never been refuted. The government didn't refute it. They just said we won't let anybody do any more of that kind of research. That is not a scientific refutation. That's a governmental refutation. That's the Inquisition back in business again. No, you can't research that. We have passed a commandment. But as long as the research was legal, it all tended to support Leary.
Nixon called him the most dangerous man on earth. And he was. He was dangerous to the established order.
And that's one of the most rebellious things you can possibly do in the society, to speak for freedom. And Leary was always speaking for freedom. The freedom of an individual to do what he wants with his own body. My body, my consciousness is my own business. And that comes directly from Timothy Leary.
LSD is simply the modern yoga made possible by advances in science, which have produced these incredible chemicals which we call psychedelic drugs.
Dr. Timothy Leary became a rebel guru to thousands of young people who wanted freedom in choosing their own lifestyles. And in the 1960s, the notion of freedom wasn't limited to drug use.
Most of us in those days were prisoners of parents who absolutely believed that everything America did was the best thing in the world. And most of what America was doing at the time was not a good thing.
In the fall of 1964, the University of California at Berkeley became a battleground of protest. The free speech movement began with student organizers Jack Weinberg and Mario Savio, denouncing an education system that they felt pandered to America's military interests.
There is a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. Mario Savio.
The free speech movement started because they didn't want CIA recruiters on campus because the CIA was really behind the war in Vietnam. And so they felt it was not appropriate that they should try and recruit students.
When Weinberg was arrested for his political activities on campus, a student strike followed. Berkeley was in many ways the birthplace of 60s protest movements.
It was just a matter of being free intellectually on a campus to talk openly and give out literature and protest. And that's where the repression started most blatantly, and so it was a reaction to the repression.
John Stuart Mill said that liberty resides in the rights of that person whose views you find most intolerable. And so it doesn't really make any difference whether it's saying fuck or saying America is a police state. It's just saying the thing that the dominant society is going to find difficult to deal with.
The free speech struggle at Berkeley lasted into 1966. Administrators finally agreed to most of the movement's demands. Academic authority gave ground to the voices of sons and daughters. In the expanded minds of individuals and in political action groups, a breakaway culture was forming. And across the San Francisco Bay from Berkeley, in the district known as Haight-Ashbury, the counterculture tribes were gathering.
There was nothing about the Haight-Ashbury per se that was magic. It was a cheap rent district next to the park, and that was its main. I mean, we were all beatnik neophytes. We would have all lived in North Beach if we could afford it, you know. But because of the attention paid to the beat movement, you couldn't afford the rents in North Beach.
And that brought basically a bohemian community into a new kind of self-identity, an identity that was infused with a visionary capacity and a common visionary experience. It might be compared to almost like a monastery. It was like a neighborhood monastery of people who were experiencing the divine and could recognize it in each other.
With the help of the Beats, it was time for the hippies and the activists to come together. On January 14th, 1967, they met in Golden Gate Park for the Great Human Bee Inn. Beat poets Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, and Michael McClure came to pass on the mantle of social rebellion to a loved generation.
When they had the Great Bee Inn, in addition to all the Van Young rock and rollers, you had the beat poets. You had Michael McClure, who was a mature older brother, and you had Gary Snyder blowing the conch horn that drew everybody together, and Alan, leading everyone in Hindu chants at the end. And there was an attempt to make a community. And any smart community knows that you can't, a good community has variety.
We were their older generation. We were there and were working with it. The difference was that we, as Beats in the 50s, had a much smaller community.
It started out as almost an adversarial relationship because the political activists thought that the hippies were irresponsible. You know, there was a war going on and they're just smoking dope in the park. But they came to realize that smoking dope in the park was a political act of civil disobedience against an unjust law. At the same time, the hippies thought that the political activists were just playing into the hands of the administration by protesting this war. But then the hippies began to see that the political activists were right too. They could see that there was a connection between getting arrested for smoking pot in this country and dropping napalm on kids on the other side of the world and burning them alive.
There was a conscious effort made to unify the Berkeley contingent and the San Francisco contingent, and the BN was that vehicle. And that was an attempt on all of our part to show that even if we had tactical differences, we had common goals, you know, that we had a common values and understanding.
San Francisco became a kind of Mecca, and there was a sort of pilgrimage toward the West, and it was like a generation of pioneers who went west without killing a single Indian along the way.
When I think about it now, how I just assumed that whether I had any money or anything, everything was just gonna kind of work out, you know, and I never feared. Surely I would find a roof over my head even if I didn't have a penny in my pocket, you know, kind of thing. And in a way, there's something liberating about that.
There was a lot of energy, a lot of understanding that it was possible in a very modest way to step out of the reigning culture and create something based on some different rules. There's a model for that, for anybody who doesn't want to live a conventional life. It worked fairly well. It's arts-based. Most people, what little money was in that system was coming out of either music or tangents like posters, whatnot. And it worked, as long as it stayed small.
By the fall of 1967, the Haight-Ashbury hippie community had received enough media exposure to make it a target for both conservative critics and commercial interests. Just as beatniks were stereotyped a generation before, hippies were now tagged as an easy-to-identify label.
The hippie had become such a media phenomenon, so they had a march called the Death of Hippie. They wanted to be called Free Americans, which, you know, a sweet little old lady wasn't like to say, "Get a haircut, you free American."
I caution people also about things like long hair and granny glasses and beetle boots and all the, you know, trappings that we associate. I mean, again, there was nothing magic about those things. They don't really say anything about what was, you know, happening inside us, and that was what the importance of that revolution was about.
Walking, stalking, no time but talking.
New York City had a counterculture community of its own in the 1960s. The Lower East Side of Manhattan's Greenwich Village was still a crossroads for society's outsiders. It had been a bohemian enclave for decades and was now Grand Central Station to the Big Apple's flower children.
It was just in the air, this feeling of being like a blade of grass growing through the concrete, you know, and suddenly seeing the light and seeing others who were sharing in this kind of thing. You didn't know exactly what to call it, but you knew you were breaking through something that had been holding you down.
It was like the center of the universe. People walking around, writing, singing, playing, getting crazy and having fun, and all at the same time. They were serious and they were tripping out. I mean, it was a different world. There were busloads of tourists that came from all over the world just to see the weird people, just to see the hippies. I mean, it was like we were an attraction.
Because that's what the village was. It was a freedom of speech, freedom of art, freedom of education. Everything was happening there. NYU was sitting right in the middle of it. A lot of students.
The East Village was also headquarters to the nation's most outspoken anti-war organizer. Abbie Hoffman came to New York from Worcester, Massachusetts, where he had begun a lifelong career as a grassroots political firebrand.
Our motto is, ask not what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you.
Hoffman's dramatic Vietnam War protest of the late 60s came on the heels of earlier work for the civil rights movement. But it was his role in the peace demonstrations staged at the 1968 Democratic National Leadership Convention in Chicago that ultimately brought him notoriety and troubles with the law.
Abbie was incredibly brave, and I think started just as an organizer in Worcester, he had already been through the worst of what you would face physically for having unpopular beliefs but standing up for your beliefs. He realized that he cared more than anything about social justice, and the fight for social justice became his mission in life.
He was a natural leader, and he told me I wasn't a leader because I didn't urge people to do things. But he had a charisma about him. When I first met Abbie, I told him how much he reminded me of Lenny Bruce. You know, he had this spontaneous, fearless wit, and you know, he said, "Wow, really?" He said, "Lenny was my god." And so this kind of started an instant friendship with us.
On October 21st, 1967, Abbie Hoffman led a bizarre march of anti-war activists on the Pentagon. It was a blend of civil disobedience and comic street theater. When Washington police threatened to use a mace spray on protesters, Hoffman announced that the marchers would respond with their own weapon, a skin-penetrating agent containing LSD.
The whole idea was the put-on, making people stop and think and do a double take about what they're doing and question their version of reality and question their ideas.
We would get thousands of hippies to join hands around the Pentagon and exorcise the Pentagon, lift it 15 feet in the air and turn it orange to bring attention to the ridiculousness of the war.
That was the famous moment where Super Joel put a daisy in a rifle barrel. But it was incredibly, incredibly scary because there was this face-off between us and them, and they would like make a decision to sort of gain a foot. So they would advance, usually with lots of baton beating of people. There were here and there'd be people lying on the floor with the soldiers beating them and other people trying to rescue them, and I would always think I was going to be next.
In early 1968, Hoffman and his associates created an informal organization that combined elements of the psychedelic consciousness revolution with street-level political action. Youth International Party members called themselves Yippies, and their plan was a mass demonstration against the Vietnam War to be held in conjunction with the Chicago Democratic National Convention. A Yippie was a hippie who was going to Chicago.
The Yippies created a myth about going to Chicago. It just seemed natural to go to the Democratic National Convention, but we had to figure out how to attract large numbers of people, of protesters and demonstrators, and it seemed natural to make it a countercultural event, the Festival of Life, versus their convention of death.
It worked. It became the headlines in Chicago papers that were like, "Yipes, the Yippies are coming." So it was a myth that became a reality.
We have come to Chicago to fight!
The streets were filled with thousands of demonstrators, and there was a great festival feeling of calm and of happiness. It's like the streets are ours. And when thousands of demonstrators occupy the street, it's not violent at all. We're just all standing there, all feeling very together. I always remember this very magical period of calm, the calm before the storm.
Basically, it was nonviolent protest in the classic Martin Luther King style. The cops just came wading in with tear gas and mace and clubs and clubbed people and gassed them and beat the hell out of them. And they especially were vicious against the medical volunteers who were trying to treat the people the cops were beating up.
In the wake of unprecedented police brutality in Chicago, Abbie Hoffman and 7 others were charged with conspiracy to cross state lines to incite riot. The federal trials that followed caused a media frenzy. The defendants became known as the infamous Chicago 8.
At first there were 20 protesters indicted and 8 cops, and then I was one of the 20, but then they wanted to have the scales were just as balanced, so they just limited it to 8 defendants. And the trial was a showcase for to try and display the difference between mainstream America and countercultural war protesters.
One of my favorite pictures of Abbey is of him doing a somersault in front of the federal courthouse, which he did on the opening day of the trial. And for me, that just said it all, because I can't imagine anybody but Abbey would even think to do that. None of the people who were indicted in Chicago, the Chicago 7, or originally 8 with Bobby Seale, they were not well known for anything except being organizers. They all believed they were innocent, and they were.
I think part of my jungle is the jungle in which I fight as the guerrilla is made up of electronic equipment like this microphone and that camera and that light. And television, for me, is part of my reality. So I believe in fighting in that reality. That's part of my jungle, the world of television. And it influences my life. And everything that I do, or any of the yippies do, is an advertisement for a revolutionary way of living, a new life that's possible.
Abbie Hoffman and his co-defendants were found guilty on their conspiracy charges, but subsequent appeals overturned the verdicts. The Chicago police riot had focused world attention on the American government's increasingly violent response to anti-war protesters. Hoffman came under constant FBI surveillance. He would eventually flee to a fugitive's life underground. Separated from his wife and child, he called the counterculture struggle a second American Revolution.
They're going to have to cut off a lot more than our head to stop the revolutionary fervor growing among young people. They're going to have to cut our heads off.
He was a target, came out in even in the Nixon tapes. So he wanted to be an organizer. That's what he wanted. He wanted to start a school for organizing, and when you're in prison, it's hard to organize. He wanted to be free, and he wanted to be free not for its own sake, but also so he could, continue to rabble-rouse. The lesson was, and that I learned, what the yippies and the pranksters and the underground press, what they all had in common was our culture was our politics.
Let's welcome Mr. Richie Haven.
My favorite thing about the whole thing was flying over all of those people and looking down and saying to myself, well, we finally made it. We're above ground now. They cannot hide us anymore. We made it. I have talked about Woodstock every day since it happened. I kid you not. I kid you not. Every single day. It wasn't sex, drugs, and rock and roll, babes. Definitely wasn't. That was not what it was. It was about Vietnam. It was about civil rights. It was about everybody coming together who had a complaint or a beef with the way America in and of itself was going and the way the government was taking us.
Coming in from London from over the pole, flying in a big airliner, chicken flying everywhere around the plane. Could we ever feel much finer?
Woodstock was one of those rare events where we knew at the moment it was going on that it was historic. At the critical edge of a page in history, a moment happened where people woke up and were nice to each other, and were friendly to each other. And what a wonderful thing that is to know it existed one time, one place. That means there's hope for other times and other places.
Coming into Los Angeles, bringing in a couple of keys. Don't touch my bags if you please, Mr. Custom.
What we were trying to establish is the interconnectedness of everything, the fact that we're all the star. And I think we pulled that off pretty well.
The 1969 Woodstock Music and Arts Fair became the capital city of a new nation. Its 3 days of peace and love symbolized a generation's best hopes for humanity. But in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War was mounting a daily body count, and the killing would soon spill over onto Midwestern American soil. In early 1970, news reports of U.S. troop movement into Cambodia began circulating. Students at Kent State University in Ohio staged demonstrations against this escalation of an already out-of-control war. On May 4th, the National Guard was called out to extinguish the protest. By the end of the day, 4 students were shot dead. 9 others were wounded.
About 20 of them, the whole regiment lowered their guns and opened fire, straight fire.
They've got the guns. You know, they'll shoot us down. And they did in Kent State. The establishment shot down their children. You know, the parents, they'd had enough. And they said, kill them. And they did. They killed us in Kent State.
That, in and of itself, was also part of why our parents began to believe us. How elder people started to move over across that line of saying, wait a minute now, we've gone a little bit too far. Shooting kids in Ohio is definitely a little too far.
The 1960s closed with events that focused attention on violence and death. But counterculture rebellion was an affirmation of life. LSD never made it into the water supply as was often feared. But the psychedelic revolution did bring new perception, even for those who didn't take the drugs. The politics of inclusion and participation couldn't win over everybody, but there was a major shift in many people's views of democracy. Abby Hoffman pointed a way for conscientious objectors to dissent in the face of an unjust war. Timothy Leary's motto of think for yourself, question authority, remains a creed of personal freedom. And Ken Kesey's belief in the magic of joyful play will always ring true. As Oscar Wilde once said, a map of the world that doesn't include utopia is not even worth glancing at.
People that you meet had shoes upon their feet and something to eat. And wouldn't it be fine now if all humankind had shelter? Basic human needs, basic human deeds, doing what comes naturally down in the garden when no one is apart. Deep down in the garden of your heart.
It was amazing to watch that all come together, and tremendously exciting to be part of this movement of social change. And that social change in the 60s, of course, was geared by the change in consciousness.
Doors were opened that had been closed before, so that the young people who came into the world later found doors open for them that had been closed for former generations.
Nothing meant anything unless you acted upon it. So whether you burned a draft card or you put yourself in the front lines of a demonstration, risking your life, you felt very alive and very intensely involved.
Well, I think that generation, that time, it was instrumental in stopping a war, that there was a sense of unity, that there was a sense of kindness, that can be recaptured, that is present, that still exists, that we did make a difference.
It was terrific. I highly recommend it. If there was some way I could send people back in time to 1967, I would do it, because it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
So what we were about was evolving our own rites of passage that evolved an acceptable pattern of adulthood that we could live with, that we could understand, that we could relate to, and that we could leave to our children, hopefully. But of course, they'll evolve their own, because circumstances change.
One of the great revolutionary lessons is learn how to grovel. Learn how to look at your feet. Say, oh, darn, I done it. Yep, you got me. Give those bulldogs their chance and not go against them. If you go against them, you're connected to them. We could all stand out here and give him the finger, but we don't want to tease a bulldog. He knows there's no grass growing here. Anybody that's done anything with dope at all knows that you've brought in your harvest by now. That cop knows that I am a threat. And he's right. I am a threat to him. I'm a threat to his wife and to his kids, because I represent a threat to the life that they have embraced, and they know it's a lie.